This is part 7 of my American road trip series, in which I'm narrating one scary story from every US state. Be sure to check out all the other episodes in the series after this. Don't worry, they're not in any particular order. Thank you to everyone who sent in their stories so far. Now, get ready as we continue on down Route 666. It was summer in small-town New Mexico. I was about 15 years old at the time, and since school was out, I was doing a few odd jobs around town to earn some money. Mowing lawns, walking dogs, anything that could make me a few bucks, you know. There was this one guy who lived in my town, an older gentleman in his early 70s, Mr. Lesnar. He used to be a teacher at my school, but I hadn't seen him for at least a year. He was bald, with a big white beard. Put a red suit on the guy and he could have passed as a mall Santa. I always remembered him as being a nice, friendly guy, so when I bumped into him in town, I asked if there was anything he needed help with. He said there was. He needed help reorganizing a few parts of his house, said that he'd pay me $50 if I helped him. When you're 15 years old, having $50 in your pocket feels like being a millionaire. I took him up on it. The next day rolled around, and I went over to Mr. Lesnar's house and knocked on the door. He answered with a smile on his face and invited me inside. First thing that struck me was the stench. His house had that old person smell about it. I didn't know much about the guy, to be honest. I mean, yeah, he used to teach at my school, but all I really remembered about him was how he always wore socks with sandals, and how he always spent every school vacation down in Mexico. I started off by cleaning up in the kitchen. Once I'd finished, Mr. Lesnar told me that he wanted help boxing up some things in the basement. Said he had too much junk down there, and that he wanted to reorganize and get rid of a load of it. Told me to start boxing things up, and to come and tell him when I'd finished. There must have been a set of 12 stairs that led down into this strangely large, stale-smelling basement. Mr. Lesnar flicked the light switch. A lone, dusty light bulb illuminated the basement. I grabbed a few folded up cardboard boxes and made my way down. So, there I was, just boxing all sorts of things up in this grungy basement. Must have spent about 45 minutes down there by myself. While I was working, I happened to lean against a particular spot on the wall. When I leant on it, I came across something odd. A loose panel in the basement wall. Not a broken part of the wall, mind you. I mean, this panel was intentionally loose. Well, curiosity got the better of me, and I started fumbling with it. It came right off. Behind the panel was a small compartment. Hidden inside that compartment was a box. It felt like finding a hidden treasure chest. I checked to see if Mr. Lesnar was standing behind me at the top of the stairs. The coast was clear. I knew I probably shouldn't, but I pulled out the box. I lifted off the top, curious to see what the old man was hiding inside. At first, it didn't look like there was much in it. A journal, a few knickknacks, and a small pile of photographs, maybe 10 or 12 in total. I took out the photos. My heart immediately sank after looking at the top one. At first, I could hardly believe the image. It showed Mr. Lesnar with a pistol in his hand, kneeling down next to a dead woman lying in the dirt. Her lifeless eyes were staring into the camera lens. She was clearly Mexican and had obviously been shot. The second photo was almost identical, only this time it was a male who stared lifelessly at the camera. No, this can't be real, I thought. I flicked through all the pictures, every damn one. Each one telling the same story. They all showed Lesnar, knelt down next to some bloody, human game, sprawled out on the ground in front of him. All of the victims varied wildly in age. There was writing on the backs of all the photos, but it was all in Spanish, and I couldn't make it out. Still, I knew instantly what this was. A box full of sick mementos from Lesnar's trips to Mexico, hidden away from the world in a small wall compartment. In some photos, Lesnar looked younger, In others, he appeared to be in his mid-60s. In all of them, he was kneeling down next to his victims, with the same disturbing grin on his face, posing like a hunter with his trophies. I was overcome by this weird mixture of shock, disgust, anger, and, most of all, fear. Fear that I was in the basement of the monster in these photos. Without thinking, I shoved the images back inside the box and slid the container back into the wall. I desperately fumbled with the wall panel, trying to put it back in the exact same way it was, not wanting the old man to realize that I'd discovered his horrible secret. I'd just about got the damn thing back in place when I heard a creaking at the top of the basement stairs behind me. I turned to see Old Man Lesnar standing by the basement door, looking down at me. I have never felt more like a rat in a cage. "Looks like you're doing a good job," he said. My heart skipped a beat. I just mumbled something and tried to act like nothing was wrong. "Oh, don't mind me. I'm just going upstairs for a nap. You keep on going down there." With that, he slowly turned and walked off through the hallway. There was maybe 20 seconds of silence before I heard his footsteps making their way up the stairs to his bedroom. My mind was racing. Had he seen me fiddling with the panel? Did he know that I'd found his photos? Oh God, was I in danger? I was only a scrawny kid. I decided not to stay down there wondering. I waited for a few moments before bolting up the basement staircase. I dashed towards the front door, grabbed the handle and twisted. No good. The damn thing had been locked from the inside. I figured the old man had just locked it before he went upstairs. I scanned the door to see if there was a way to quickly open it. No time. I could hear movements above me. The old man was walking back out of his bedroom and towards the stairs. I sprinted through the hallway and into the kitchen. I knew from the cleaning earlier there was a back door there. I grabbed the handle and prayed. With a twist, it flung open. It felt like winning the lottery. I flew out of that house, ran around the property, and back onto the main street. I looked back only once. When I did, I saw the old man's face in one of the downstairs windows. He looked to be holding something. I was too far away to make out what it was exactly, but I bet you can guess what I thought it was. From there, I kept on running until I got home, thankful that the old man lived in a cul-de-sac and not in the middle of nowhere. If he did, I'm certain he'd have taken a shot at me. It goes without saying that I told my parents what I'd found. We notified the authorities about it, and I told them about the secret panel and the sick mementos in the box. When they checked the place out, they did indeed find the secret compartment. Predictably, it was totally empty. There was no box hidden inside, no evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever. They figured I was just messing with the old guy or something, and decided not to look into him any further. I don't know what Lesnar did with the pictures, whether he destroyed them or hid them elsewhere, but he got away with it all regardless. Old Man Lesnar lived another 8 years after that. In that time, I graduated high school, went off to college, and moved out of town. My parents always lived in that same place, however. For all the time I lived there after that incident, and whenever I'd go back to visit my parents, I'd always be looking over my shoulder. I knew that Mr. Lesnar wanted to take his secret to the grave, and I always worried that he'd try and silence me to do so. It's hard to believe there are people like this, who, to the outside world, are leading seemingly ordinary lives. I'm glad I didn't become his last trophy. This next entry actually comes from one of my earliest videos, but I've always considered it to be one of my favourite stories, and I've wanted to redo it for a long time. Here it goes. During the midsummer, usually around the middle of July, me and a few of my good friends, Ryan, Kevin and Tommy, always made time to go up to Kev's family cabin, located on Vermilion Lake, way up north in the forests of Minnesota. Throughout all of our young years, we would always be accompanied by Kevin's dad, and sometimes a few of our dads as well. Once we were juniors in high school, however, we felt mature enough to go to the cabin on our own, finally without Kevin's dad or any other adult supervision. My friend's cabin was very remote and very little, based upon a large island. Other cabins were on the island, but the next one closest to us was a solid half-mile away at least, and you could only get to it by taking a man-made path around the island. I want to mention that to get to my friend's cabin, you had to park on a gravel road on the opposite side of the island and take his boat across the lake about a half-mile. Vermilion Lake is huge. My mind always had a tendency to run around while I was sleeping there. The cabin was all on one level, with only 2 bedrooms next to one another, a kitchen and living room area connected to them, and a bathroom in the back of the cabin. There was always one window in each of the rooms with no curtains to them at all, so it was very easy to see outside to the woods and lake. And this is where my mind would run, as I always thought about someone peering in. They never were, of course. I had been to the cabin about a dozen times during my lifespan, and nothing bad ever happened there, so the older I got, the easier it was to sleep. Now for the event. On this particular trip, we planned to stay around 5 nights. On the 3rd night during the trip, when we were finally on our own, we had set up a campfire and had been drinking beers all night. I don't condone underage drinking, but being the rebels we were, we just so happened to sneak some. We went out to the dock to stare up at the magnificent stars and enjoy our buzz, when all of a sudden, we heard something out on the water that sounded like a fish jumping out to catch a bug. We quickly looked over at the lake, wondering where the splash came from, our fishing poles at the ready. Thankfully, the moon was out that night, which lit up the lake. Without it, it would have been pitch black, what with there being no city lights for miles upon miles. Ryan began to point out to something. Guys, what the hell's that? After looking closely and finally spotting what he was pointing at, the only way I can describe it is it simply looked like a head floating out in the middle of the lake, staring at us directly. It was about 3/4 worth of a football field out in the lake from the dock. It had long, black hair and a very pale, skin-like face, but I couldn't make out the eyes, mouth, nose or chin, as if it was just a blob of pale skin with long black hair over it. I'll never forget that feeling that came over me. The hairs on my legs, neck and arms all stood up, and I felt paralyzed on the inside and ready to go home at that moment. We told ourselves it was just a loon. Those birds are very popular night drifters on the lake, and they do their hunting late. I mean, it was possible that a loon all of a sudden popped up in the water after hunting for a bit. At least, we tried to convince ourselves of that scenario. All of us had the creeps. That damn thing wasn't moving one bit, just treading water in the same place. We went back to our campfire, lit it even brighter, and headed inside to drink more. We soon forgot about the head-like thing with the help of the beer. That is, until I had to use the bathroom really bad, and the one inside was preoccupied. I went outside to do my business, seeing how we were in the great outdoors. Whilst taking a pee and glancing at the beautiful moonlit lake, I noticed that the black, circular object was still there, but about 30 yards closer now, still looking as if it was staring right up at me. I could easily see the nose on this thing's face. Again, it was very pale, like it hadn't seen the sun for years. A very, very uneasy feeling came over me, and I immediately went back inside and told my friends to come and look. They all came outside to see it still there, looking at us as if the head was corked up and its chin was in the air. Nobody dared go down to the dock anymore, and we immediately went back inside, deciding it probably wasn't a loon. For a loon to stay in the same spot for almost an hour or two made no sense to any of us. This head-like object was stiff as a board and not moving a single muscle, just staring up at us from the deck. There was no ripple effect from it at all. We said it was just a log and went back inside. I could tell everyone else felt uneasy too. A few hours passed. It was super late into the night at this point, and we all knew we needed sleep. Being my curious self, I looked back outside one last time, and the black object had completely vanished. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, thinking the log must have floated off or just hit shore somewhere else. There was no AC in the cabin, and we had to open the windows, or else we'd fry in the middle of summer. Me and Tommy slept in the living room, while my 2 other friends slept in the 2 bedrooms with their doors open. Not being able to sleep, but keeping my eyes shut, I began to hear someone walking around outside at the bottom of the stairs to the cabin. I thought I was about to have a heart attack. No question that whoever or whatever I heard down there was on the deck, pacing back and forth, their feet clicking on the wood. It was as if they weren't sure what to do with themselves. It lasted for about 3 minutes. I wanted to whisper to my buddy, but was frozen in fear. I just kept my eyes shut and my ears on full alert. The footsteps sounded like they took 2 rapid steps up the deck stairs all of a sudden, but then turned around and sounded like they were sprinting away down the man-made path. After it sounded like the steps were long gone and a couple of minutes had passed, I woke up Tommy and asked him if he'd heard the steps. We both sat up and were startled by Ryan walking out of his room and saying, "We need to leave. Now." There was something very disturbing about his expression. I asked him why. He woke up Kevin in the other room. "Come on, get to the boat. It's time to go." "What? Ryan, what the hell's wrong with you?" Kevin asked. Ryan explained to us quickly while grabbing his stuff. I'll never forget what he told us, nor will my other friends. He said that when he was turning sides on his bed to get more comfortable, he saw someone peeking in at the top right corner of the window. The figure quickly shifted out of his view. He said all he saw was one eye, ghostly white skin, and long black hair down the window. When looking back at what he experienced, it chills us to the bone to realize that since this face was in the top right corner of the window in my friend's room, it was either damn near 8 foot tall, standing on something like bricks trying to peek in, or was floating. Tommy and I told the others what we had heard outside the cabin, absolutely disturbed the hell out of our minds and feeling like we were going to be sick. We all packed up our stuff and booked it, not cleaning the cabin or anything. We locked up, and as we headed down the stairs, we saw bare footprints in the dirt, heading off along the path and all around the cabin. We picked up our pace, made it to the boat, not knowing what was watching us or around us, threw our stuff in the boat, untied it, and sped off. I didn't even think about the head in the water. My eyes were just glued to the island, trying to spot anything moving. I saw nothing. When we finally got our stuff packed in the car, we hopped inside and took off. We drove for about 10 miles, when, out of the blue, Ryan all of a sudden broke down in the car, sobbing, saying things like, "What was it, guys? What was it? Oh God, what did I see?" We called to tell our parents what had happened on the way back, told them that Ryan was freaking out. They said to just get home safely and quickly. It was late, about 4 or 5 in the morning, but no one slept. It was a very quiet ride home. My friend's dad, who owns the cabin, went up that following weekend. Said he didn't experience anything weird while there, but did mention that the bare footprints were still lingering about. That bugged him badly. What Ryan saw in the window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping for multiple nights, and ended up having to seek help for a couple of weeks and hop on some sleeping medicine. As time went on, he ended up being fine, but isn't too comfortable sleeping next to a window without a curtain. To this day, I can't explain what happened, nor why it seemed to happen to us. Nothing has ever happened at that cabin since that night, so we're told by Kevin's dad at least. I personally have never gone back to the cabin, which really makes me sad, because I have some great childhood memories from there. Tommy and Kevin have both been back and been fine, but Ryan refuses to ever set foot there again, and I'm with him. A lot of people have cabins on that island, so it could have been a prank in the making, and Ryan busted it when he saw the person in the window. It could also have been a person wanting to do something worse to us. I'll never be able to explain what was floating in the lake, but the fact that that incident, along with the footprints and someone looking in at Ryan, all happened in the same night, Seems like more than a coincidence to me. I was out hiking in Morgan Monroe State Forest with my girlfriend one afternoon. It was a nice day, and the insects and birds were chirping away. Out of nowhere, the pair of us heard what sounded like 3 gunshots, one after another. They went off not too far down the trail. We looked at each other. A few seconds of silence. Then another 3 shots. "Is that gunfire?" my girlfriend asked me. I nodded, unable to think what else it could be out here. We decided to turn back, not wanting to chance running into some hillbilly nutjob or whatever. What struck me at that moment was the lack of any kind of sound coming from the woods. After the shots rang out, there wasn't any kind of nature sound at all. I mean, I get that the birds might have been scared away, but even the insects had fallen silent. We were both getting some weird vibes. The situation just felt unnatural. In amongst all the surreal silence, we heard one thing just behind us. Footsteps snapping on twigs. We turned to see who was following us. I half expected to see a hunter with a rifle. I was wrong. Moving down the trail towards us was this thing. A humanoid figure that obviously wasn't human. It was like looking at a living silhouette. Even in the light, it looked like it was hiding in the darkness. The thing just looked like a shadow. That's the best way I can describe it. The sunlight just wasn't hitting it for some reason. From its outline, it looked to just be skin and bones. And it was tall. Real tall. At least a foot larger than me, and I'm not a small dude. I'd scarcely believe I'd even seen the thing had my girlfriend not been there as well. It was walking in long strides, gaining a lot of distance with each step. Needless to say, we bolted back the way we came. I've no idea if that thing pursued us or not. We were both too terrified to turn back and look. We made it back to our vehicle and hightailed it home, not stopping for anything. We've never been back to Morgan Monroe since. Unless the both of us momentarily lost our minds at the exact same time, then there's something out in those woods, and neither of us plan on going back to find out what it is. So, near where I live, but a little farther out in the sticks, there's a glorified gravel path in the woods called Rube Hill. It runs maybe 3 miles long, and only half a mile of it's paved. On the south end is the pavement, with a few old but otherwise normal houses dotted around it. Deceptively average at that point. Then, the houses end, the pavement ends, and the gravel road shoots up a steep hill. It's not taken care of at all. The gravel's piled up in potholes and berms, so unless you're driving a nice off-road vehicle, you'd want to take it easy. Since you'd need to drive slowly, you'd get a nice view of the handmade signs nailed to trees with messages like, "No trespassing," and "We're watching you," scrawled in Sharpie. At the top of the hill, the road winds lazily for a little under a mile before diving back down the other side of the hill. The gravel is in equally crappy condition on this side. After you reach the bottom of the hill, the road cuts straight for about a mile through cornfields before intersecting with another road. The reason I'm so familiar with the layout is that I've taken friends out on late-night drives along this road to scare the bejesus out of them. Never an elaborate prank. I'd just drive slowly and play creepy music to get them amped up and paranoid. I always made sure to tell them about the meth heads and their labs out there, and how the sheriffs try to avoid going there because it's dangerous. I figured it was all hogwash. Just stories, you know. But now I think there's an element of truth to some of those rumors. I was with my friend Aaron one night, and we decided to go on a late-night drive along Rube Hill to freak ourselves out. We took off, drove down the various country highways and back roads, and turned onto Rube Hill. I made sure to play extra creepy music, since Aaron and I had made the trip many times before. It honestly lost a lot of its creepy luster on me, but I still enjoyed the long drives and scaring my friends. Of course, the drive mostly went by uneventful, and we were almost across the hill, about to descend the other side. That's when Aaron started freaking out. I checked my mirrors to see what had spooked him so much, and saw truck headlights down the road behind us. They seemed to be back where the road first topped the hill. The truck made it under the only street light on the top of the hill, a really dim orange light, and I could see it was kicking up a ton of dirt. It was speeding towards us. I paused the music we were playing, and sure enough, with the windows down, I could hear the gravel crunching and flying, like the vehicle was speeding. Keep in mind that I've driven this road dozens of times, both during the day and at night, and not once have I ever encountered another vehicle. So, having a truck speeding to seemingly catch up to us at midnight on a road supposedly filled with rumored junkheads was pretty jarring. Usually, I don't relinquish my brakes driving down that hill. This time, I didn't even touch them. Thankfully, we got home safe and sound. The next day, I'm hanging out with one of my other friends, Chris. Chris and I are lounging around, playing video games, talking about quantum physics, Chris's favorite thing, and Chipotle, my favorite thing. I, of course, told him about Aaron and I being chased, and I kind of hammed it up, made it come across more harrowing than it really was. Now Chris wanted to go to the road, so we waited until late at night, about 2 AM, and drove out to Rube Hill. This time I wasn't playing any music. I wanted to be alert. It was all going quite normally, just like usual, when I slammed on my brakes. I threw the car in park and turned to Chris. "Oh, dude, you can see that too, right?" Chris was just as confused as me. He looked at me and nodded. My headlights were clearly illuminating a thick metal cable stretched across the road in front of us. On the right, it was wrapped around a tree at roughly head height for an adult, and it was pulled taut across the road, anchored to a fence post on the left at roughly chest height. We were both sitting there, wondering what to make of it, when we heard gravel being thrown by tires behind us. I checked my mirrors, and sure enough, truck headlights were tearing arse down the road. I started freaking out. My breathing and heart rate were out of control, and I began sweating. Chris just swore quietly under his breath. I threw it into drive, pulled as far to the right as I could, and my low-sitting car slid under the cable with a loud metal-on-metal scraping noise. I cringed as I heard the scrape, but I wasn't about to sit there and get deliveranced. So again, I flew down the hill, and this is the creepy cherry on the sundae for me personally, because Chris didn't see it. As we left the tree line and entered the cornfields, I glanced to my right, past Chris, and briefly caught a glimpse of somebody standing about 3 or 4 feet back in the corn. I just felt my stomach scrunch up, and I floored the accelerator. I glanced in my rearview mirror and could see a man standing in the road behind us, illuminated by the moon and my taillights. He had a long object slung over his shoulder. I couldn't tell if it was a cane or maybe a rifle, but I didn't stay to find out. Before I could even tell Chris about it, we were around a bend and out of sight. That car had a scrape mark on the roof the rest of the time I owned it. It was a good reminder of why I never went out to that road again. In the middle of summer last year, my best friend Roberto and I went hiking in the woods in the Richmond area of Virginia. We got up before sunrise and packed our backpacks with food, water and energy drinks. He was training to go into the Marine Corps, so this was one of many exercises I did alongside him to help him get in shape. We got to the state park right at sunrise and were the first ones there. Our goal that day was to hike 14 miles from one trailhead to the other, so we dropped his car off at the far trailhead and parked mine at the trailhead that we began at. The sun was already up by the time we got moving along the dirt trail that hugged the banks of the lake. Even under the shade of the canopy, it was still brutally hot and humid. We were drenched in sweat by the time we reached the mile mark. Aside from the humidity, it was a great hike. That is, until we reached mile 9 and saw this middle-aged white woman holding a small dog in her arms, standing in the middle of the trail ahead of us. Roberto turned off his Bluetooth speaker, and we could hear that the lady was crying. She noticed we were there and began walking briskly back towards us. "Please wait, I really need help." We could see that she was soaked in sweat and had obviously been crying for a while. "Please help me, I'm lost and it's so hot out here." Her poor little dog was panting like crazy, and I noticed she didn't have any supplies with her. I pulled out my water bottle and began pouring some onto a leaf. The little dog drank it immediately. I offered the woman some of the water as well, but she politely refused. After talking with her for a couple of minutes, she told us that she had parked her vehicle on the other side of the trail from where we had started, and that she had walked for only a mile. We told her that she was about 5 miles away from where she claimed to have started. She kept repeating that she was too tired to keep walking, and that she was worried for her dog. Roberto pulled out his cell phone and called the ranger station. He explained the situation and our location to the ranger who answered, and the ranger said that they would come by boat and pick her and her dog up. We walked towards the bank of the lake to wait for them. This is where things started getting weird. The lady's exhausted demeanor vanished, and she became very animated. She was saying that she was so thankful for our help, and that she wanted to repay us. We told her that was unnecessary, and were just glad that we could help her out. She then asked if she could give us a hug. I told her sure, just to be nice. It was strange, and I did get a weird vibe from her, yet I didn't want to be rude. Roberto, on the other hand, told her no, and used the excuse that he was too sweaty for hugs. That's when the lady's good mood came to a screeching halt. You'd have thought that he cussed her out or something. She stopped talking and just stared at him with this sinister look. Then she began talking solely to her dog, saying things like, "Don't say another word to them. We don't like them anymore." Roberto and I just looked at each other, a little freaked out. We could see the small motor-powered John boat approaching with 2 rangers in it. We waved them down and waited in silence until they pulled up along the shoreline. The lady walked towards them and handed them her dog, then turned around and gave us the most evil look imaginable. The park rangers helped her into the boat and waved goodbye to us. She just sat with her back to us as they began gliding along the water towards the entrance that she parked at. Roberto and I laughed it off. Like, what a weirdo, we thought. We helped her and were nothing but nice to her, and she gets all mad at us for Roberto not giving her a hug? Unbelievable. We finished our 5 remaining miles and arrived at Roberto's car in the parking lot. When we got close to his car, we could see that there were dents all over the hood that weren't there before. He began running towards his car, enraged, when, from behind a picnic area, that lady we helped earlier appeared. She came running at Roberto with a goddamn hammer in her hand. She got right up close to him and started swinging. Luckily, she missed, and he caused her to trip when he moved to avoid her. We then held her down and called 911. When the cops arrived, she started yelling about how we were hurting her and told them to shoot us. They came over and took her away. We had to write up incident reports for the cops and recount everything that happened. As it turns out, this woman had broken into her ex-husband's new family's apartment and stolen their dog the night before. The crazy part is, one of the cops responding to the situation said it was his cousin, and that she had just posted a video of us on Facebook Live while we were walking back to Roberto's truck. In the live video, she was whispering repeatedly, "I'm gonna kill them." Her ex-husband saw the Facebook Live video and called the cops on her that very moment. The cop said she used to be a normal lady who worked in the school system until she snapped and became this demon-like person. Hey guys, lazy.
I thought nothing could scare me, and then I went to Crow House. I was doing another stint in jail when I first heard about the house. My cellmate told me all about how he wanted to break into it as soon as he got out. That might sound a little weird, but Tommy said he had his reasons, and I didn't care enough to pry. In hindsight, I should have cared a lot more. At Lights Out, Tommy told me so many strange stories about Old Man Crowther and the house he had built by hand. But I only half listened as I focused more on getting to sleep. I used to make Tommy so mad by having a good night's sleep. He'd say something like, "Man, that story about the moving shadows didn't scare you?" Nope, it did not. None of them did. Mainly because I knew they were just stories kids told to other kids. Nothing like that was going to be as scary as my first purse snatch, or the drug deal I negotiated with the Triads, or the dozen other times I faced the barrel of a gun. But that fearless attitude tripped me up so bad after I got out of jail myself. Tommy showed up one day with another dude who was roughly twice my size. Yet Tommy introduced me as the man with no fear. So, of course, I couldn't back down from what I thought was a heist of the Crow House. Tommy wasn't leaving anything to chance. He sent me to City Hall. I was going to get the blueprints Crowther had to have submitted when he got his permit to build all those years ago. I zoned out while I drove. Must have, because I remembered driving, and then I was there. The receptionist told me that the permits and building department was just 2 rights and a left, down a hallway she pointed out. 2 rights, then a left. I repeated it as a mantra and found the office I needed. Soon enough, I had the blueprints in hand. I looked over them briefly, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. The Crow House was built like a maze. I wasn't worried. I knew how to get around a maze. I'd just touch a right hand on the wall and eventually make it out. Boring and inefficient, but it'll work out in the end. Story of my life. So I left, repeating a new mantra, a right and then 2 lefts. But after that second left, I found myself turning to a bookcase-covered dead end. Confused, I went back and then to what I thought was the first left. After a while, I found myself back at the door to the permits and building department. I opened it for help, but a new hallway greeted me. It ended with a T intersection, but there was some red graffiti painted on the marble wall. It said, in my handwriting, "Don't go left, it just loops around." Suddenly, I jolted awake. I was laying on the ground in front of a T intersection with the same graffiti. Memories flooded my mind as I remembered getting back from City Hall, planning with Tommy, driving up to this cursed house and entering it. A day ago. Sorry for the theatrics, but I needed you to understand what this house does to people. It's not just a confusing layout, it actively tries to mess with you. I thought it was some gas leak disorienting us at first, but the things I've seen and felt and killed, they couldn't all be figments of my imagination. For a while, we stayed focused and even quickly found Crowther in the living room. It looked like he'd been dead for several months, just rotting in a chair in front of his television. We prodded his skeletal remains, and their presence actually emboldened us to take our time exploring the nearby rooms. There wasn't much worth stealing. We knew that coming in, to only expect the money that Tommy was giving us. Regardless of what we found, he had already paid us $300 each and would pay us another $500 after the job. Apparently, 4 girls had gone missing when Tommy had lived on this block. He was obsessed with proving that Crowther was behind the disappearances. Obviously, I regret taking it, but it seemed like easy money at the time. We ended up leaving the blueprints in the living room because it seemed to be mistaken at every turn. The house seemed absolutely normal, so we didn't mind splitting up. I know, dumb move, but the sun was shining bright and we were 3 dudes convinced we were the scariest thing in that house. Tommy took the dude who called himself Thor, and they headed down to the basement, since that's where he was most likely to find the remains of a murder dungeon. I went straight to the upstairs and quickly searched the bedrooms, but found nothing. The attic stairs came down easily enough, but I found no windows up there, which made the darkness stifling. It seemed to swallow the dim beam that came out of my flashlight. Because the light couldn't reach the walls, I felt like I was wandering around an infinite void. To tell the truth, I liked the feeling. It was otherworldly, and I felt like my imagination was inspired for the first time in a long time. But this must have given whatever influenced us an opening. I turned around, expecting to see a softly glowing square showing how I could get down. Instead, I saw nothing but darkness. I panicked for the first time then, running towards where I thought the door would be. Instead, my body fell through the floor with a tremendous crash. My fall was broken by a bed below, which wasn't as lucky as it sounds, since my ankles painfully smacked the wooden footboard. I laid, expecting the house to come alive with angry yells about what a moron I was. Instead, it remained silent outside. After I confirmed neither ankle was broken, I left the room and found myself in the upstairs hallway, still with the attic stairs pulled down, but it now seemed twice as long and accommodated twice the rooms. I went straight for the stairs, but walking down them just led me to another hallway full of rooms. I wandered around and opened doors, but only found more hallways behind them. Turning around showed a similar sight of more rooms where the stairs used to be. At first, I thought my fall had messed me up more than I thought. But no matter how far I walked, or how much I rested, nothing got better. I didn't understand it. I didn't need to. I just went into survival mode and forced myself to stay calm. I touched the right-hand wall of the next hallway I entered and walked as fast as my sore ankles would handle. I ignored the flickering lights. I didn't turn to see what was going on with the shadows in the corner of my eyes. I wasn't going to be distracted from my goal of getting out of this place. I called for help at regular intervals, but never heard from the rest of my crew. Instead, I eventually found myself looping back around and out to the first hallway. That's the problem with the right-hand trick. It doesn't work if you started out with a disjointed wall. That's when I started tagging the environment with the spray paint I carried. We had intended on spraying "Murderer" over the front door as we left, but all those plans were dead to me. I thought I made some progress, but this was a large maze, so I ended up eating the few snacks I carried and taking a nap. That nap led to the crazy, realistic dreams I had. Since the graffiti warned against going left, I went right. A right and then 2 lefts. I had found myself repeating the mantra from my dream. With nothing left to lose, I followed it, and the second left led to a room. The kitchen. I ran over to the fridge and opened it wide. Yeah, that wasn't my brightest move. To be fair, I was starving. I wasn't thinking of how everything in there would be spoiled if the owner had been dead for half a year. Worse, there was way more meat than there should have been. Just plate after plate filled with rotting meat. I recoiled from the sight and smell of it all. But that's when I saw them. 2 large pit bulls had walked into the kitchen and were already starting to bare their teeth at the sight of me. I still wasn't scared. These were flesh and blood enemies, things I could hurt. I thought I'd take that any day over head games. I pulled out my revolver, but the sudden motion caused them to charge. In my haste to react, I fired wide, and then I had both of them on top of me. I fell to the ground and sacrificed my right arm, using it to shield my face while I pressed the revolver against the nearest one's ribcage and fired again and again. I saw the pantry door open, and Tommy peeked out. I screamed at him to help me, but he actually asked, "Me? Are you talking to me?" Even with one of my arms being torn to shreds, I could have strangled him. I put the revolver against the head of the dog that was still ripping and tearing the flesh and muscle from me. The pain was unimaginable. I fired once, and the bullet entered just behind one eye and exited out the other, grazing my elbow. But it didn't stop eating me. I fired again and again. Half its skull was gone, but the jaws seemed to work just fine regardless. The next time I pulled the trigger, my gun just impotently clicked. I started hitting the dog with the handle when Tommy called out, still from the pantry, "Are you done yet?" Furious, I yelled back, "It won't die. Help me!" Tommy opened the door, walked right up to me, bent down and asked, "What won't die?" I stared at him, then looked back to the dog. It wasn't there. The other dog was no longer weighing me down either. I stood up and examined my mostly uninjured arm. The bullet graze was the only damage. I started to explain to Tommy, but he shook his head and said, "It's the house, man. It's been nothing but insanity since Thor and I entered the basement." Tommy started to tell me where Thor was, what was left of him, but I stopped him. I told him that it didn't matter right now. We just needed to focus on getting out. He tried to tell me, "No, you don't understand. We found the girls, man. We found them." As dispassionately as I could, I told him, "No, don't tell me what happened, because it's only what you think happened. When we get out of here, Thor could be alive, and it could turn out the girls were never here. Whatever you hear, see, or smell does not matter. I thought those dogs were real, and I wasted all my rounds. We're going to get through this by being smart and careful from here on out." I didn't tell Tommy that I was only half sure that he himself was real. It wouldn't have helped anything. Either way, I was happy to have someone else around. We were just as lost, but the company helped. The kitchen door opened to a library with a long mirrored wall on the other side. I ignored it and instructed Tommy to do the same, even though, when we had come in, I thought I saw our reflections doing everything we did, but with the wrong hand. I was steadfast in my desire to not let the house fool me again. I knew the tropes. I'd seen hundreds of horror movies. Maybe this was just gas, maybe ghosts, but I'd figured that whatever was going on, we could only be hurt by ourselves, which meant that if I just kept my head down and stepped carefully, we'd make it out eventually. And then we reached the dark room, seemingly randomly. We just opened a closet door, and I found that eerie black void again. Somehow, I found this comforting, since it was one of the first oddities I had noticed about the house. Maybe it would be one of the last. But we had to get through it either way. Tommy and I, such tough, strong ex-cons we were, started to hold hands. It was dark enough that I could never see all of Tommy at one time. I swept my flashlight over him several times in that dark room, just to make sure it was his hand I was holding. Then my light briefly illuminated movement behind Tommy. I didn't explain. I just pulled him along faster. But while I looked behind, something caught Tommy's eye from the front and he yelled at me to look out. I snapped my head forward and saw that our light was finally reaching a wall. We had found the end of the attic. I was fully prepared to knock down a wall and drop 2 or 3 stories to the ground to get out of here, but Tommy pointed up. My light followed the direction his finger pointed, but it struggled with the darkness in the air. Still, I could make out that there was something hiding in the corner of the attic. The upper corner, where the walls met the ceiling. Something big. It started to walk down the wall. The details were hard to make out, but I counted 8 legs. That's all I needed to know, and started attacking the wall with all my might. I slid the metal in between the wooden planks and pulled them out slowly. Tommy tried to warn me that the spider was closer. I looked up and could see that it appeared to grow more, smaller legs, but it was only a little closer. Shaking my head, I just told Tommy to quit worrying and help me get out of here. He asked me, "Man, does anything scare you?" I just grunted in reply, but really had felt like the house had thrown me a softball. I've never had a problem with spiders before. I get not liking something small crawling all over you, but making it a giant spider removed any fears I might have had. And then the next strike against the wall produced a thick stream of sunlight. I tore into it greedily, right as the thing above fell down, right next to Tommy. I turned around to tell him not to worry, that the spider wasn't real, but all the words left me. Standing behind us were 4 girls. They were all pretty, wearing white nightgowns, and seemed to have their heads fused together at the scalp. They were permanently in a crab position, with their backs towards the floor and only their feet touching the ground. Their arms flopped around as they moved in sync towards Tommy. All 4 girls were sobbing. I didn't wait to see what else they could do. I was terrified. I launched myself at the small hole I had made and squeezed myself out of that house like I was the last bit of toothpaste from a tube. After I popped out, a spray of blood followed. Quarts of the stuff. I tumbled from the roof and my vision was disoriented from the rapid changing direction of my head, the blood in my eyes, and the bright light that seemed to blind me even when my eyes were closed. It didn't matter. I couldn't stop myself if I tried. I fell from roof to eaves to another lower floor, and then again until it felt like I was falling down a flight of stairs, until I hit the bottom and realized I had been falling down a flight of stairs. I was still inside the house. My despair was short-lived since I also realized I was next to the living room. I crossed it to get to the front door. I only slowed to pause before Mr. Crowther's corpse. I didn't know what he did, how much of this insanity was because of the house, him, or whatever, but I still wished I had bullets in my gun, because I would love to drill him in between the eyes. That's when his grey, paper-thin eyelids opened, and he stared at me with completely white eyes. That scared me pretty good. I grabbed the nearest thing to me and ended up breaking his left forearm and shoving the arm bones into his left eye. I pushed it in hard, trying to hit brain. Instead, there was a squeal of pain that sounded like it came from within the head, and green blood, for lack of a better word, squirted out from behind the ocular fluid. Whether or not that meant he would truly die, I left him still writhing in that chair. I needed to get out. It was almost welcoming to burst open the front door and see the sea of red and blue lights. I found out later that my gunfire resulted in the neighbours calling 911. I didn't mind. I needed the company. Even as they threw me to the ground and handcuffed me, I was happy. At least, until I got paranoid about all this just being another hallucination of the house's design. Now, there's a lot that scares me. Spiders and things that look like spiders scare me. Going to sleep and waking up scares me. Stairs scare me. But I get to stay locked up where it's nice and mostly safe for a long time. They have no idea how I twisted Thor into the pretzel they found, and they never found Tommy's body, so the death penalty is out. Still, it didn't look too good to have all of Tommy's blood covering me. They keep me in solitary because I keep splitting my cellmates' heads open to check for little men that might have green blood, just in case. But at least my insanity defense looks to be strong. I'm hoping I can get transferred to a more comfortable hospital soon. In the meantime, I just have to be on the lookout for any logical inconsistencies. The house isn't going to trap me again so easily. If I'm still there, I need to find out as soon as possible to escape. Wait, it's not helpful to think like that. I must remember I'm safe. Of course I'm out. It's been weeks since I left the house. I think it's been that long anyway. It's really hard to keep track of time all alone in here. Oh, sorry, I'm not thinking clearly. I can just check the calendar on this laptop. But this laptop... How did I get a laptop in solitary confinement? Wait, where am I? Where am I? Where am I? I actually cleaned up my act a lot. My memory's still fuzzy on how I got a hold of a contraband laptop, but the guards took it away as soon as I made all that fuss. Anyway, I got a great public defender who was able to save me from the murder charges and even the breaking and entering of the old Crow house. He truthfully argued that we were in there because of a reasonable suspicion of a foul play, and we had rightfully searched the place for survivors after finding Mr. Crowther dead in the living room. It helped that none of the prosecutor's experts could agree as to how exactly Thor died, and they never found Tommy's body. I was still convicted of the assault after I'd been imprisoned, but I took a plea deal and just got 5 years probation, the majority of which I would spend at Oregon State Hospital. Of course, nice as my lawyer was, I never fully trusted him. I had made a sort of peace with the thought that I may have still been trapped in the Crow house. Its illusions and spectres looked, felt, and even smelled real. I can still remember the pain of feeling a dog ripping the flesh off of my arm. So it took a good year before I felt like I could relax. You can only be paranoid for so long. Then you just get tired of all the fear. I decided that if I was in a hallucination, I would just wait and see where it all went. And truthfully, I figured that if the house could create illusions this good, then I was a dead man no matter what I did. Either way, I managed to make life work at the hospital for long enough. Eventually, my memories of the house faded, so I could start to sleep naturally again. I made lots of progress with my therapist about issues that plagued me before the Crow house, and I eventually got a clean bill of health from the hospital. I got a job as a librarian of all things. I'm heavily tatted, but none on my neck or face, so I go to work in a long-sleeve sweater with white gloves. I've always considered myself an intelligent brute, but after a haircut and a shave, I actually looked like I belonged there. I didn't completely let the Crow house slip from my mind though. I used my position to study up on that location and found some pretty interesting stuff. Police reports and newspaper articles revealed that the land the Crow house was built on had been terrorizing people long before Mr. Crowther owned it. Probably the most interesting of which was an incident with the people who owned the land before Mr. Crowther. Only the husband made it out of a house fire that he freely admitted to setting himself. He had a wild tale about moving across the country for his job, only to find his new office was a maze of cubicles that he couldn't get out of. According to him, half his new co-workers were out to kill him, while the others seemed just as scared and lost as him. He said he must have wandered those grey walls for days without ever finding an exit. Instead, he finally managed to find a lighter and set the nearest cubicle ablaze. Of course, he was only trying to get the firefighters to come and rescue, but it was only when the fire had spread too far to stop that he suddenly realized he was standing outside his own home. The rest of his family had been asleep and unable to escape. 3 days after his arrest, he had hung himself in jail. Just like I almost did. The fire cleared a way for Mr. Crowther to buy the land and build the monstrosity of a house that I had been trapped in. While they didn't have as much trouble as I did, it still took the police weeks before they officially cleared the house of the 4 bodies. Oh yeah, that's also why I managed to get off so light. Besides Thor and Mr. Crowther's body, they also came across the bodies of a couple in the basement. They had both died of heart attacks and were found sitting in the corner, holding each other tight. The couple had died long before Mr. Crowther, and it helped paint him in a bad light, even though there wasn't enough evidence to definitely say what had happened to them. All this news made me feel simultaneously more and less sane. I clearly wasn't the problem going into the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forever corrupted by it, even if I really did escape. You might be wondering why, if I suspected I was still in the house, I would trust anything I was reading. Well, I'd never read anything like this before. I figured that when I was speaking to someone, if I was still in the house, then it was like speaking to the house. Same thing with reading. The information had to come from somewhere. True, it could have been the house messing with me, but I thought it was more likely that it would brag about itself. All of it got pushed to the side when I met Sandy. Every day, she would bring a kid in for my library's storytime hour. I finally got the nerve to just talk to her. Not only did I think she was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen, but I was worried that she was the trap that the house was building to. I was lonely enough, though, that I just went for it. Illusion or not, she was beautiful, and, as it turned out, very single. We started dating, and suddenly, the world got a lot brighter. It felt more real too. I got to know her son, Mason, and he actually seemed to like me. So, you know where this is all going. First, life got great. Then, Sandy and I married. I won Oregon's Librarian of the Year. I found out Sandy was pregnant with a girl. My life was now perfect. Too perfect. I had never forgotten about the Crow House. It was always there in the back of my mind. When I got angry at Sandy and maybe took it a bit too far, she always forgave me. Too easily. Mason was too good a kid. My work too easy for too much money. I tried to ignore the feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it was easy at first. I guess I really didn't want Sandy to be fictional. But then, a new book, to me, was returned to the library. A history of a tribe that is split from Modoc Native Americans that used to live around here. I started reading it to figure out which shelf it needed to be returned to. Just after the first page were 2 maps to where this tribe used to live. One was what the land looked like at the time they occupied the area. The other was the same image, but with a current map overlaid on top of it. The second map clearly showed me the Crow House right next to the tribe's main camp. After seeing that, whether or not I was still in the house, I felt like this book was a message for me, so I kept reading. The tribe called themselves Dinega Maglax, which roughly translated to the Sun-Setting People. They were a sort of cult that had been ostracized from the larger tribe for their beliefs. Basically, they thought the world was going to end soon. However, their leader had once come upon a cave with long, twisting passages, and this man had an epiphany on how to save the world, at least temporarily. he immediately started making sacrifices of the young women in the tribe, and when the world didn't end, his efforts were declared a huge success. He didn't just kill the girls though. They were drugged and then carried deep into the cave with plenty of food and water. When she awoke, the girl would be free to try and find her own way back. However, the author of the book theorized that the whole maze was rigged. Maybe with a stone that covered the entrance. Nowhere could they find any evidence that anyone survived this exceedingly slow execution. Plus, the tribe wouldn't have wanted a survivor. The whole point was to have the young woman to have hope, but ultimately fail. For her to constantly pray for the gods' guidance, and for these prayers to get increasingly more heartfelt and desperate as time went on. Basically, they were trying to wring every last drop of devotion out of their sacrifices. And it worked. Or at least appeared to. They figured the gods wouldn't want to destroy the world as long as it could still produce praise this pure. Either way, using the death maze got so popular that they eventually had to kidnap young women from other tribes and then use people of all ages and genders to keep a steady flow of wretched prayers coming. This led to a war with the larger tribes, and the Dinigamakalax were finally wiped out. Their conquerors feared the cave though. They thought it haunted with hundreds of lost souls that were still trying to find their way out. So they filled the entrance and stayed far away. At this point, it came as no surprise that the location of the cave was exactly under the Crow House. The book did have one last shock for me though. Immediately after finishing it, I looked at the author to see if I could maybe find them later. The book was written by William Crowther. There was no author photo, but it couldn't have been a coincidence. I practically threw the book away from me. The house was taunting me. Somehow, it had delivered the book to me. The easiest explanation was simply that I was still in the house. I tried to reject that idea once more. I left work immediately and drove home. Sandy was on the phone with my confused boss when I got there, but she was already telling him that I wasn't feeling well. I just went to our bedroom and flopped in the bed to try and think things through. Soon, Sandy joined me and asked what happened. I had never talked to her about my stay in the mental hospital, or what happened at the Crow House. She had known about all my other stints in prison, but that's it. So, I finally told her. When it was over, Sandy looked scared, but she told me that she believed that I believed it happened. Then she said she had some good news. My boss told her that it was clear I was having some trouble at work today, so I should go ahead and take tomorrow off too, so we can get a 3-day weekend. Sandy started to say how we should use that time to relax together, but I cut her off. I told her something along the lines of, "Don't you see how wrong that is? Bosses don't give you time off if you leave work. They fire you." We argued for a bit more, but I felt silly arguing with a house, because that's who I had to really be talking to. The house was pretending to be my wife. I told her that I was onto her. She had trapped me before, but wasn't going to trick me anymore. The thing that called herself Sandy burst into tears. She told me that I was scary. She begged me to think of our unborn child, of Mason. I almost tore into her head then and there to see if there was anything alien about her biology, but the househead Mason burst into our room while I was wrestling Sandy to the ground. In the end, I couldn't go through with it. Real or not, I don't want to see Sandy hurt. After getting up and all of us calming down, I promised I would get better. She gave me an ultimatum. Our child would be born in about a month, so she would stay with her mother during that time, and I had to use every resource I had to get better by then. Or else, I wouldn't be allowed to be a part of this family anymore, or even see the baby. like it's actually mine. I just went along with a plan to get some peace and quiet. I tried to think of a way I could escape, for real this time. I finally decided I would visit my father. We have a complicated relationship. The house wouldn't be able to accurately portray my father given how repressed my own memories of him were. I showed up at his apartment with no warning. I knocked. He opened the door angrily, but just stood there in shock for a moment. Then, he started crying. He sobbed while telling me how sorry he was and how many regrets he had. This wasn't my father. My father couldn't go 5 minutes without hitting me. This was the house, just trying to show me what I wanted again. I pushed him. He balled his hand up into a fist, and for a second I thought I saw the man who raised me again. Yet, this imposter just dropped his fist and tried to pull me in for a hug. He kept apologizing and asking for my forgiveness. He tried to tell me that he had changed a lot over the last 20 years, probably because the house knew it wasn't fooling me. It had come up with some excuse. I almost believed it. Almost. Instead, I knocked my old man to the ground and pulled my hammer from my waistband. I cracked open his head and searched for anything alien living inside. While I didn't find any, I wasn't sure how this worked. The only thing I was sure of was the bloody mess on the floor wasn't Dad. Not that it mattered to the police. After all, they were just a house too. So was the judge. That's why he was still lenient. He just put me back in the hospital again, this time for life. This house is good at mind games. It's not revealing the charade until it thinks I've let my guard down again. For whatever reason, it decided to let me have a laptop again. In universe, they told me that communicating with others would help me with my delusions. Once again, I'm playing along, but only until Mike, the orderly, stops paying attention. Recounting everything that's happened has just been to keep my hands realistically moving over the keyboard. I know there's no one really out there. It's really taking forever, but Mike can just keep watching me typing merrily along. Eventually, he'll take a break, and that's when I'll finally escape this house. I don't need long, just 5 minutes or so. Probably less than that, since I already used my spare sheets to make the noose last night. I'm escaping for real this time. As a child, I was prone to waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. I could feel the echoes of a noise that I couldn't recall, a silence that reminded me of something deafening, but there was never anything there. At first, I would simply try to return to sleep, but found myself unable to. At some point, I would roll out of my bed, pitter-patter down the hallway, and try to wake up my brother so I wouldn't be alone in the dark. No matter how loud I yelled or how hard I hit him, he would never wake up. Eventually, I would give up, crawl into bed with him, and fall back asleep myself, comforted by his presence. I was just a little kid who looked up to his older brother, and I believed that he could protect me from anything, even in his sleep. As an adult, the problem persists. However, there is no one here to comfort me now. I live on my own, no family in the area and no girlfriend to speak of, but I still find myself waking up in the dead of night at least once a week. It is no longer to a silent sound that I can't recall, but instead to the cries of a screaming baby just one house over. I don't mind it so much. I know it must be more of a hassle for the parents than it is for me, but it can be tiresome. Instead of tossing and turning in bed, I brew myself some hot cocoa, add in just the smallest spike of Crown Royal whiskey, then make my way to my computer chair. There, I enjoy an hour or two of warm conversation on 4chan before the fuzzy feelings of sleep invite me back to my bed. When I first awoke last night, I had no reason to think that this was any other than business as usual. If the baby had been crying, I seemed to have just missed it, but it wasn't something I gave much thought to. It was a bit earlier than usual, about 2 a.m, and I stayed at my computer until almost 6. Sleep was not calling my name, but I knew if I didn't return to bed, then there wouldn't be another chance until the following night, as I had plans to meet my friend for a trip to the beach. So I crawled into my bed, pulled the covers up over me, and let myself be comforted by the waves of warmth that followed. As was typical, I found myself rolling over here and there while waiting to succumb to my tiredness. But it never came. Rolling around quickly became tossing and turning, and I found myself constantly checking my phone. Outside, the sun had still not risen, something that began to confuse me as 8 a.m. rolled around. I had to wake up in an hour or so anyway, so I figured I might as well get an early start and take a shower. Before heading into the restroom, I stopped to look out the blinds of my window, and was surprised to see there wasn't even a crack of dawn in the distance. I mused over whether or not I'd missed something important, as if I could drunkenly forget daylight savings in the dead of summer. The thought of it made me laugh. That stopped when I returned from my shower, however. It was almost 9 a.m. now, but the sun still wasn't up. I flipped open my phone with frustration and began to Google search for my time zone, thinking that my Android's internal clock had simply messed up. But the internet showed the exact same time I was seeing on my device. This led me on a hunt across the house, checking the time on every piece of technology I had. Everywhere I looked, I found the same answer, from the computer in my office to the old watch I'd buried at the bottom of my junk drawer. When flipping through the channels of my television, everything seemed to still be playing late-night programming. There was no early morning news, no talk shows, and no traffic or weather reports. Instead, every station was playing classic Looney Tunes, syndicated family sitcoms, and the kind of infomercials people only witnessed when no one else is awake. I took to the internet, scouring every social media platform I could find to see if anyone else was noticing this too. Facebook had updates, those midnight thoughts of people who stayed up a bit too late, but they all ended right before I woke up. I tried replying to posts and reaching out on Messenger, but no one got back to me. They didn't even leave me unread. Next, I tried my cell phone. I started with texts, but I was too impatient to wait for a response. I began to call every single number I had, even hotlines and businesses, but no one ever answered. I left messages everywhere, begging them to talk to me, begging them to tell me what was going on. But no matter what I threw into the void, no one answered. I even placed my call to the local police station, first a non-emergency line, but then 911 when I only found an answering machine. Even there, I was greeted with an automated message, however. After hours of harassing people online and on my phone, it was now well past noon. I had checked my windows regularly to see if anyone else on the street was awake, but if they were, they never left their houses or even turned on the lights. I didn't blame them. I was scared to leave too, but at this point, I had exhausted all my other options, and so I donned my shirt, slipped on my sandals, and made my way onto the street. There is something unsettling about trying to leave your house late at night. Despite the darkness, however, this wasn't night. It was technically now afternoon, though that fact only made it more intimidating to step out into the dark. I considered bringing some sort of weapon, but going and knocking on neighbours with a crowbar in hand probably wouldn't get me invited in. I began my search 2 doors down, where I was on relatively good terms with the man who lived there. We were the only 2 on the block who lived without families, just 2 single men in their smaller homes with spare rooms. There was an unspoken understanding between us that we reached out to each other first when in need of anything. Most of the families surrounding us had children after all, and were less likely to have the time or resources to help. His name was Kenneth, and he had knocked on my door some months ago in the middle of the night. He had hurt his hand pretty badly and didn't think he'd be able to work the steering wheel on his own. As such, he owed me an understanding reaction for knocking on his door if he wasn't already awake. But he didn't answer the door. I tried knocking on his windows and garage before giving up, but there was no response there either. I moved on to the house between us and immediately rang the doorbell. Again, no answer. I continued up and down the block, knocking on every door and window that I could. I gave up trying to be quiet, on trying to only alert the person in the house, but I never heard a single noise in return. Even the house next to mine returned nothing but silence when I began beating my fist against the door. I couldn't believe it. This family had an infant son who cried at all hours of the night, yet he had no reaction now. In my frustration, I began kicking around their trash cans, trying to cause some sort of commotion to get anyone's attention, but to no avail. I returned to Kenneth's house, this time ready to let myself in. His entrance was locked, but he was definitely the kind of man to forget about his back door. I let myself in, not bothering to sneak around or tiptoe, as I wanted to alert him to my presence if it turned out he was actually home. I made my way to the end of his house, fully expecting to find an empty bed in an empty room. But it wasn't empty. There he was, just sleeping in bed. His hair was a tad bit messier than usual, and it appeared he was naked if the discarded boxer shorts on the floor were any indication. But he was there, and seemed perfectly fine. I said his name. I went from soft to shouting in a matter of seconds, unable to understand why I didn't wake him up before with all of my yelling and knocking. Even at this close proximity, he remained asleep, however. But what if he wasn't asleep? A chill ran through me as the thought entered my mind. I rushed to the side of his bed, checking for a heartbeat or trying to wake him up. I shook him, I screamed, I even tried hitting him, but nothing woke him up. His heart beat faster and his breath became heavier, but he stayed unconscious. Even opening his eyes with my hands had no effect. I practically threw him across the room in my attempt to break him out of his slumber, but he fell without any resistance, completely limp. He was a living corpse, unable to react to anything. But was he the only one? I made my way out of his house, grabbing a spare object on my way. A frying pan that Kenneth had left on the counter. I crossed his yard directly into our neighbours, to the family with a screaming baby that had now become silent, and began to smash at their sliding glass door with my pan to create an entrance. I needed to see the parents, the children, the dog, to see if one of them would wake up. But none of them did. The parents shared their bed, the daughters were tucked in, and just like Kenneth, I was unable to wake them. I made my way to a room at the end of the hall, one I knew must house their infant son, since he was the only one I hadn't seen yet. He had a pulse and a heartbeat, just like the others, but he stayed asleep no matter what I did. I had dark thoughts of using the frying pan to bash his head in, to dare him to move, dare him to end this insane prank that the whole town seemed to be playing on me, to cry like he did every other night. But I stopped myself. Instead, I was the one who cried. It wasn't manly, it wasn't smart, but it was what I did. I just sat there in that little boy's room and cried, not knowing what else to do. Even calling the police had just led to an answering machine. What else was there? I was all alone in the dark of night. At least, that was what I thought, before hearing a noise from behind me. I froze, equal parts excited and terrified at the prospect that someone else might be awake. I looked around, trying to figure out where it had come from. I was certain it had to be in the house. Then I heard the noise again, and a feeling of familiarity began to creep over me. It was a sound I could never describe, one that I could never remember. Yet somehow, it was one I could never forget. It was the sound that woke me up each night as a child, the sound that faded away as I returned to consciousness, leaving me to think I only imagined it in the silence. And it was in the room with me. I turned slowly to see the thing that made the sound behind me, barely visible from the shadows of the little boy's closet. It didn't look like a person, and yet it wasn't a monster either. It was impossibly tall, with arms even longer than its legs. It had to hunch to stop its head from pushing straight through the ceiling, and it smiled from ear to ear. No, that wasn't a smile. It didn't have cheeks or skin on its face. It just had teeth. Teeth that stretched from one ear to the other to make it look like it was smiling. But it wasn't. It reached across the room from the little boy's closet, its fingers finding my face from almost a foot away from its palms, and it began to search me. It touched every muscle, every pore, every cell in my skin as it explored my features as if it were blind. But it was staring right at me with its dark eyes. This was the thing that woke me up at night, the thing that woke up this little boy, that made him cry out in the darkness because of what he had heard, or perhaps even seen. I could feel it in his touch, his loneliness. It had followed me throughout my life, shrieking its strange shriek in the silence that somehow only I could hear, daring me to wake up, daring me to notice him. And I finally did. Today, it got me to look him in the eyes and share in the horror of the deafening shrieks it made with its teeth somehow slammed together while it searched my face. The little boy woke up too, crying just like he did every other night. The creature in the closet turned away from me, its fingers no longer caring to explore me, and instead focused on that poor little boy. I wanted to get in the way. I wanted to yell or scream or hit this monster with a frying pan. But I just ran. I ran away from the room, from the house, from the street, and ran until I couldn't run anymore. The baby's cries suddenly stopped before I was out of earshot. I don't know why, and I don't think I want to. I just hoped it was that he was like everyone else, that he just went back to sleep. But I don't think that's how this works. It has now been over 24 hours. The sun was supposed to rise again, but I know it won't. In every house on the street I broke into, I found someone sleeping, but I didn't try to wake them up. The farther I went, the more I began to fear that this was everywhere, that this pattern of living corpses would stretch on forever. My tiredness comes and goes. Sometimes I feel like I'm on the brink of passing out, and I welcome it. Then I hear the thing shrieking in the distance, and I'm brought back to a lucid state. No matter how far away I get, I can still hear it, and it's getting closer. As I write this, I'm on the edge of town. I found an unlocked door and let myself in, needing to refresh myself with a shower and get some food. I doubt the owner will ever wake up, but in case he does, I am writing this note for him. I wish I could write more, but I know that the creature is coming for me. I was careful sneaking in here, but no matter how far I go or how quiet I am, it does seem to find a way to catch up with me. I have decided to steal this man's key and take his car. I'm not proud of this action, but it seems to be the only way I'll be able to get to the next town over without crossing paths with that monstrosity again. I've decided to head north, to my brother's town. I do not think he'll be awake, but that has never been the case when I sought his comfort in the night. Instead, I just hope to find him asleep. Perhaps if I spend the night in his bed, I'll fall asleep as well, like I did when we were children. If this message does manage to be found, I hope its story can help others. On those nights where you awaken before the sun comes up, where you could have sworn you heard something, but find yourself surrounded only by silence, know that you aren't crazy. And whatever you do, go back to sleep. If you can. Perhaps if I spend the night in his bed, I'll fall asleep as well, like I did when we were children. I've been here since I was 2 years old, and by all accounts, I had a normal upbringing. That's owed to the fact that this is an altogether normal place. The people work in other nearby towns or craft wares here that they sell in those aforementioned places. Lives lived here are all those of typical small town residents, save for one aspect, a law that has been around long since before the town itself came into existence. A law that was set in place by unknown peoples at an unknown time. A law that has been tirelessly enforced by all peoples who have called this place home since. A law that has been abided by all who set foot in this place, except one. The law is simple to abide. Never touch the water. All children who are brought up in Humming Lake, which, by the way, is a colloquial name, are taught from the youngest ages to never touch the lake itself. For me personally, I never knew why the law was put in place, nor did my parents, nor theirs. The reason for the law, and the consequences that would arise from breaking it, has been lost to history. Simply put, it was a rule that is always followed, an inherent regulation which we all abided, however blindly. You might ask, well, why would you live on a lake that you apparently cannot enjoy? And it's a fair question. The reason is that along with that law being passed down, so too has been the residents of Humming Lake's unwavering protection of the lake. For us, the lake has always been treated as a decoration, a massive idyllic painting on display at the edge of the northernmost residents' backyards. And besides that assumed responsibility, it's simply a wonderful place to live. Out here, the nature around us is part of our town itself. Beautiful views, hiking, camping, rock climbing. It all amounts to an ideal, simple place to live for people seeking a simple way of life. We're about 40 minutes from a larger town, so while secluded, we aren't totally disconnected from the rest of the world. We just don't go in the lake. Last summer, we found ourselves under the oppressive thumb of an overwhelming heat wave, as it surely isn't difficult to imagine the seductive gazes from our curiously dark yet still glistening water were frustratingly tempting. But still, the townspeople of Humming Lake obeyed our cardinal law. It was easy enough. Other summers had proven similarly unbearable, and we made it through. Above-ground pools provided the same respite that cold showers and sprinklers did, but for 8-year-old Rodney Hartle, such substitutions weren't enough. For Rodney, the siren song of the 1.7-acre lake was too alluring to resist. While spending the afternoon running around with friends in the Danforth's backyard, which, after a small ditch, led directly into the lake, under the watchful eye of their parents, Rodney went inside through the back door to use the bathroom. Shortly thereafter, while Cal Danforth manned the grill, he saw in his periphery a shirtless Rodney Hartle sprinting from the front yard down the side of the house. It took Cal a moment to realize what was happening, and by the time he did, it would soon prove to have been a moment too late. In a split second, the spry 8-year-old had breezed by him, all while screaming in the kind of defiant voice only a child can truly muster, "I'm going swimming." Everyone's heads turned with faces of abject terror as Cal dropped the spatula to the ground and tried as he might, the only person with even a hope of catching the rebellious boy before it was too late. The rest of us watched with wide eyes as Rodney took step after rapid step with every intention of plunging himself into that forbidden abyss. He took a barely noticeable larger step over a shallow ditch, and in 2 more steps he would be feeling the water that none of us had ever felt against his skin. Were it not for Cal Danforth. His long strides caught up to Rodney Hartle, and he stretched his arm out, just able to hook around Rodney's waist. But it was too late. The force behind Rodney's dash pulled Cal with it, sending the two tumbling down. Cal's entire right side became soaked in the impermissible waters, while Rodney wound up on his hands and knees. The rest of us stayed frozen in apprehensive anticipation as Cal scrambled to get himself and Rodney back on the grass. Amber Hartle screamed and buried her face in her husband's shoulder as we all waited for whatever unspeakable horror was surely about to befall the man and the boy by the water. And, in many of our minds, us. But nothing happened. As the two sat, terrified on the grass, just out of reach of the first man-made ripples Humming Lake had seen in innumerable eons, Jim Hartle began screaming at his son, tearing himself away from his wife, who desperately tried to hold him back to no avail. Jennifer Danforth hurried over to her husband with towels and dropped them, then quickly stepped back. Jim grabbed a towel on his way over and used it to snatch his son up. Rodney attempted to wrap his arms around his father, frightened at everyone's reaction and his dad's own ire. But Jim pushed his son off of him at the very last moment, sparing himself from getting any of the water on him. Cal dried himself off, wisely telling everyone to stay away from him. It seemed like an eternity that we all stood there. The burgers that had been on the grill were charred to a crisp as we watched intently, half at the lake, the other half at the only 2 people who had touched it in our lifetime. But nothing happened to either. Cal Danforth and Rodney Hartle dried off, with the latter being taken home by his parents, the former then politely asking his guests to return home as well. I left Cal with a sincere, "Call me if you need anything," and went home. And for the next 10 days, everything was as it always was. Rodney Hartle was kept under a closer eye than he had been, but after a week's grounding and a stern talking to, so too was his life back to normal. On that 10th night, however, while John Darby and I sat on his back deck, overlooking the lake, cracking our 7th beer each, a rustling came from the trees over to our right, the ones just past Cal Danforth's house. John and I each turned a bit and watched as something emerged from the shadows, lit only by the cloud-covered moon behind it. We joked that Rob LeGrasse, the closest thing we had to an archetypal town drunk, had gotten lost from his way from the bedroom to the bathroom and was returning from defiling the side of a tree. But the longer we watched, the less it looked like Rob LeGrasse. The less it looked like anyone we knew. The less it looked like an actual person. It lurched along in a broken gait, taking one step in the same time any able person would take 5. Whatever it was grossly thin, leaning slightly to the front and to the side. Its gaunt, skeletal arms dangled freely, hanging nearly to its bony knees. We watched as the silhouette of this hellish-shaped monstrosity trudged along at its own leisurely pace. As our eyes adjusted to whatever it was we were looking at, we saw thin, black protrusions poking out from its pitch-black shape, as well as the fact that it was dripping. John and I both rose to our feet as the thing continued its slow march towards Cal Danforth's house. John ran inside, telling me in a half-breath that he was grabbing his gun, and moments later he returned with a hunting rifle for himself and a pistol for me. We each took slow steps towards Cal Danforth's, and even at our slowest, we were moving just a bit faster than this thing that came from the trees. "Stop right there," John yelled out. The thing didn't obey John's order. It was as though it didn't hear him at all. John loaded a bullet into the chamber of his gun. "You hear that? I said stop." Still, the thing didn't appear to have heard any of it, although this time, as it made its slow way across the Danforth's yard, coming up on the grill, it stood up straight. We were now able to see the thing's height in its entirety, and it stood conservatively at 7 feet. Perhaps it was adrenaline that kept me from hearing it. Perhaps it was my inebriation. Perhaps again it hadn't happened until this moment, but as it stood up, it made a stomach-churning cracking noise, as if its bones were all resetting. That noise persisted as it took its next step, and the one after that, and every step thereafter. Each time it lifted one of its feet off the ground for one of its heavy, short steps, it sounded like countless sets of knuckles cracking for the first time in years. John told me to run and grab his flashlight from inside the back door. I returned moments later with a high-powered handheld floodlight and turned it on, bathing the Danforth's backyard in light and giving us our first real look at the thing from the trees. Its skin was smooth, a dark, murky grey. The protrusions we'd seen in the silhouette were revealed to be twigs and sticks clinging to its body, and while it possessed no hair, part of its body was splayed with what looked like seaweed. "You asshole, I'll shoot you," John screamed, and a moment later, a light turned on near the front of the Danforth abode. The thing still paid us no mind. Another light turned on, this time in Cal's kitchen, which is situated near his back door. "Cal, stay inside," I yelled. "What the hell is that thing?" John whispered to me. I offered no speculation. "What the hell are you guys doing?" we heard Cal call out from his open kitchen window. "There's some damn thing in your yard, man, heading straight for you." As John yelled back, the thing stopped. Its bones sang their crunchy song as it turned around and faced the water. There was a deafening silence that lingered between myself and John, the lanky creature, and Cal Danforth. What finally broke that silence gives me chills just thinking about it now. We were still a fair distance away from it, so its features weren't readily apparent, but from what I could see, its eyes were little more than sunken holes in its face, and its mouth stretched much farther up the cheek than any normal person. And then, it opened that mouth. It opened an average amount, like your mouth or mine would open when we spoke, but then, accompanied by the sickening crunch of snow being packed under a boot, its jaw unhinged. All the while, water spilled from the openings in its face. It then began making sounds. They weren't words, that was clear, even despite the fact that it was talking with a mouthful of water. It was undulating. The sounds it made came from deep within its throat. Horrible, ghastly, terrifying sounds. John aimed his rifle at the grey creature and prepared to shoot. but I think he was as curious as I was regarding what this strange being was trying to communicate, and to whom. After a few more seconds of those hellish noises emanating from deep inside the thing's stomach, it stopped, and for a few fleeting moments, the only sounds I heard were my breath, my heartbeat, the soft whistling of a light breeze, and the invisible cicadas chirping their midnight song. But then the cicadas stopped, and it was that silence that made my heart sink to my stomach. That absence of all sound that registered in my brain as a signal that something was very, very wrong. And after a single moment of that silence that felt like an eternity, the lake responded. In that moment I learned from whence Humming Lake had gotten its colloquial sobriquet. It didn't have a source, at least one that I could discern as I stood there, but a distinct hum simply materialized in my ears. It surrounded us, and it sounded as though it were coming from behind me, in front of me, on both sides of me, from under me, and from above me, and from within me, and without me, all at once. It was low, as if someone with a deep voice was simply going, "Mm." I can't say for certain, but at that moment I looked at the lake, and it seemed darker. There was always an uncharacteristic dimness to the body of water, a sort of absence of the colour that might come to mind when one thinks of such a geographic feature, and more of a deeper blue, especially towards the centre of the small inland sea. Even under the moonlight, the lake seemed to swallow all light, and appeared a pitch-black pit of uncertainty. And that pit hummed, and then it stopped, replaced then by the abnormal figure in Cal Danforth's backyard and its guttural nonsense. The cicadas returned as the creature and the lake finished their indiscernible conversation, with the former turning back towards Cal. A small man, but with the courage and brashness of 100 larger men, Cal Danforth yelled out for John not to shoot it, and that he would take care of it. After disappearing into his house for a moment, and while the dripping, grey mass of bones and smooth skin made two more of its crooked, audible steps towards his home, Cal returned with a metal baseball bat. John and I watched, he through the iron sights of his gun, and me through my disbelieving eyes, as Cal Danforth stepped out through his back door, ranting and raving about how, quote, some messed up cripple wasn't going to threaten him. "You want to come onto my property?" he shouted rhetorically. "Think you're going to come onto my property and do something?" He clearly hadn't thought of what to say beforehand and was winging it in the moment. But it didn't matter what he said. Cal approached the lumbering beast, baseball bat cocked back and ready to swing. But it didn't matter. With a speed it hadn't exhibited until then, it stretched out its lanky arm and rammed two of its thin, tendril-like fingers that I would swear got longer at its whim, underneath Cal Danforth's jaw, up through the fleshy part underneath his mouth, and pulled the left side of the lower half of his jaw off. It happened in the blink of an eye, with an ease akin to a giant brushing away a fly. This thing had torn skin and snapped bone, leaving Cal Danforth standing in stupefied shock as the lower half of his face hung to one side, a mess of blood and viscera and a lower set of teeth displaced from their rightful fixture on Cal Danforth's visage. He stood there, silently, as the creature retracted his hand and flung it up once again, much in the same way it had the first time, but now without the impediment of a lower half of Cal's face to slow its thrust. Its fingers, longer again yet, plunged into the top of Cal's mouth, but this time they didn't retract. This time I watched as Cal's body went limp, held up only by the unnatural strength of its killer, and his eyes began bleeding. John and I too were in shock, and he snapped out of it first. He yelled as he began firing his weapon at the thin, murderous beast, the deafening bangs of his gun shaking me from my stupor. I began firing at it too, and after my second shot, it dropped Cal to the ground. Our shots didn't seem to affect it at first, but the more John unloaded into it, it looked to be putting up its arms, though it seemed not in defense, but in annoyance. Even still, it essentially ignored us. It resumed its slow, laborious gait, seemingly aiming to go around Cal's house. In that stressful time, I wasn't sure where its destination might be. John quickly ran the few yards back to his home and disappeared for the briefest of moments inside before returning with a machete. I voiced my concern, noting that a bevy of bullets hadn't been able to harm it. But still, John persisted. He made a wide berth around the thing, machete in hand, and was nearly to the front of Cal's house when John made his move. He swung the machete, cutting cleanly and easily into its head, splitting it from ear to misplaced jaw point, and he continued hacking away at it, with an apparently endless supply of water seeming to splash against the ground, and against John. The thing collapsed to the ground in a puddle, its entire body turning to water as it perished, dousing John and soaking his shoes and the grass they stood on. "Yeah, yeah," the drunken John shouted. "You see that, man? You see that?" He stopped speaking abruptly and stood up perfectly straight, dropping the machete to the ground with a light splash. Then he turned back, first towards what I thought was me, but I would soon realize was the lake. "Johnny?" I asked meekly, as my friend started taking rigid steps. He walked right past me in jerky, unnatural motions. I called out to him several times, each time ignored. I watched helplessly as John walked down the grass and right past me, as though I didn't exist. When I realized he was walking towards the lake, I ran to try stop him, but whatever force was compelling him to walk to the lake compelled me to stop. I wasn't capable of moving, unable to stop my friend. I was forced to watch as John slowly walked into the lake, first up to his ankles, then his knees, then up to his waist. And then he stopped. He stood there for what felt like an eon, and without any indication that it was about to happen, John Darby was ripped underneath the surface of Humming Lake. The same moment he was under was the moment I was freed from whatever it was that was keeping me in place, and not a moment later did that hum return. Only this time it was loud enough to hear a mile away. Other people had come to their houses to see what all the